Welcome to the City Show. I'm your host, John Zimkus. Now, the first thing you're going to notice is we're not in the city, but we come a little close. This is a community center, which may have been like a city some 2,000 years ago. And we're at Fort Ancient. And our guest is Bill Kennedy, the site manager and the site archaeologist. Is that correct?
Correct.
So you are in charge of not only everything that has to be done in the facility, you're in charge of what has been found and will be found on the facility.
Sure. Yeah, I act as the site manager for Fort Ancient and for Serpent Mound. I've been doing that for just a few years currently, but I've been associated with Fort Ancient for a very long time.
How long does it take to get from here to Serpent Mound?
About an hour. Serpent's about an hour south of here.
Now, a lot of people have probably heard of Fort Ancient, but what actually is Fort Ancient?
Well, unfortunately, it's a misnomer because it's not a fort. So that's the first thing that we have to explain to visitors when they come. What it is, it's a large earthwork, one of the largest in Ohio, over 2,000 years old. It was built during the period between about 100 BC and maybe about 500 AD. It was not built all at once. It was built over a long period of time by ancient American Indian ancestors. This is a ceremonial site. It's a place for the local community, but it's also a place, like many others in Ohio, that people are pilgrimaging to Southern Ohio for about 2,000 years ago.
So they didn't live within Fort Ancient?
Correct. These people did not live in villages at this time. People did not start living in villages till centuries later. They did live in permanent homes. So they would live scattered around the landscape in little river valleys. They were gardeners. But the fort itself, if we want to call it a fort, but the earthwork itself is the center of that community, but it's not an urbanized center.
Now, the Euro-Americans, when they saw these mounds forming what they thought was a wall. And it's what, 2.5 miles?
About 3.5 miles.
Oh, 3.5 miles.
Yes.
And they figured out, well, why would they have walls? It must be a fort, and it's pretty old. It's right. Fort Ancient.
Right. There's over a dozen sites like this in Southwest Ohio. Fort Ancient is the largest of them, and they're what we would call hilltop enclosures. So Europeans saw those and thought that those looked similar to military features that you would see in England and Ireland and in Europe. And so they thought that they were hill forts, and they named almost all of them with the word fort in the name. Fort Hill, Fortified Hill, Fort Ancient. They didn't really have any conception of how old these places were. Many people at the time didn't even think they were built by American Indians. They thought it must have been built by some advanced civilization that no longer existed. And that was a big topic of inquiry until the late 1800s.
Now, one of the reasons why they first began to think it wasn't a fort is because there's too many openings, isn't there?
Yes, there are openings regularly all throughout the wall. It's very large. It encloses over 100 acres. We've got 84 openings. Now, I'm not a military strategist, but if I were going to build a castle or a fort, I'm not going to make 84 doorways into it. I'm going to make one or two. But the sheer size of it would also make it extremely difficult to defend. But also, if we remember that the site was not all built at once, we're seeing the end result of centuries of construction, and that it grew, it expanded, but also the walls became higher over time. So initially, it wouldn't have looked so much like a hill fort or something like that.
No, it's a hilltop enclosure. There must be a significance of being on the hilltop. What are the estimations as to why that's the case?
Sure. One of the things that we know is they were very carefully selecting specific landforms to build earthworks on. The symbolism of how the wall is constructed plays in part to they want it to be completely enclosed by water. And here at Fort Ancient, we've got the Little Miami, we have Randall's Run, and we have Cowan's Run. We know that that was important to them because they actually artificially dug Randall's Run and Cowan's Run longer to more completely enclose the earthwork. So there are a lot of, it's not a single thing. There's a lot of reasons why they picked this particular landform. They wanted something that was mostly flat, and then they began to construct the earthwork, but they didn't construct this entire area at first. At first, it was just the South Fort. So over time, it expanded further to the north.
Now, are we in the North Fork currently?
We are right now, and as we look, we can see the earthwork wall off into the forest. These trees would not have been on it 2,000 years ago. It would have been a very different appearance.
Now, part of the problem with a visitor for the first time is they would look at that and say, well, that's a forest. Where's the walls of Fort Ancient?
Right. We know from pollen studies that Fort Ancient was kept clear, and that when we look at the pollen from 2,000 years ago, what we see are grasses and the pollen of domestic plants. Tree pollen carries for a long way too, so we know it was deforested some distance away from the earthwork. These trees were planted in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps. There was an African-American contingent that lived here at Fort Ancient for several years and constructed most of the infrastructure. They planted those trees to help prevent erosion. Mm. We now know that from studies done at other earthworks that those trees, on the whole, actually contribute a little more to erosion than they do to prevent it. Mm-hmm. It's not a lot, but it's enough that we know that the net effect is a slightly negative one. We're not planning on deforesting Fort Ancient, but we do look carefully if there are specific trees that might be endangering the earthwork because they're dying or have potential to tip over and damage the earthwork. Those are trees we would look to remove, but we don't have plans to deforest this beautiful area.
Now, a lot of people, when they think of Indian mounds, think of burial mounds. Are there any burial mounds at Fort Ancient?
Not really. Some of these sites, similar sites to this, do have a large mortuary component. Places like Mound City, for example, over in Chillicothe. There's not a lot of mortuary behavior going on at hilltop enclosures. When we think of other sites like Miamisburg Mound, which is a burial mound, that's not even from the same time period as Fort Ancient. So one thing that's a little confusing is that we may see many different types of earthworks, and they're not all the same. They don't all have the same function, and they don't all date to the same periods of time.
Now, when these were constructed, there were no beasts of burden in North America.
Correct.
And I don't think the wheel was here.
Wheel's not very good if you don't have roads. Yeah. These people did not have any domestic animals except for dogs, which they brought with them when they came to the Americas thousands and thousands of years before. So this was all done with very simple technology. They're using baskets and sharpened sticks and maybe a clamshell on the end of a stick as a hoe. Fort Ancient, the walls here represent the equivalent of 125 million basket loads of soil at about 30 pounds apiece. So this is a phenomenal effort, but they also did it slowly over 5 or 6 centuries. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, how big would the workforce been to build this?
Hard to say, but we can presume that the local population, it's reasonable to speculate that some of the non-local pilgrims who are coming to places like Fort Ancient and Mound City are also presumably participating on some level in the construction of the walls and helping to build it higher or further.
Now, they're not living within Fort Ancient, and so they're hunting and gathering outside of the walled areas?
They're doing some hunting and gathering, but at this time, people are gardening. And so they are staying place, at least through the growing season. They live in small little settlements of 1 or 2 houses. So it's just 1 or 2 families living together in a similar way to how farmers live today. They might within eyeshot of another family, but they're living sort of independently. And the plants that they're growing are plants that are not familiar to us. They grow here now. They grow all over Ohio. They're native plants to this region. But they are plants that we don't know the names of. We don't recognize modern times.
Okay.
Goosefoot, sumpweed, maygrass, erect knotweed. These are plants that we aren't really familiar with because they're just what we think of as weeds. Mm-hmm. We see them all the time. They are growing these as a staple of diet. And in particular, goosefoot is one that is probably a very important one to their economy. Many people actually have tried that and don't realize it. If you've ever eaten quinoa, that's a South American variant of the exact same plant that people are growing here in Ohio.
Now, is it soups? Is it grain for like a bread-like material? What are they doing with these crops?
you can make a variety of products from these. What you're getting out of them is seeds, and because these are very small seeds, they're either starchy or oily seeds. All these plants together can be consumed a number of ways, but what's most important is that nutritionally they complement each other well, and they grow well together throughout the year. They mature at different times, so it's a super stable economy. Simple, but stable. These are plants that are native to the region, and although they are growing domesticated versions of them, they're not going to be easily taken out by a little bit of drought or an early fall frost.
Now, when we think of Native American crops, we usually think of the three sisters,
Right.
squash, corn, and beans. Were these variants of that or early versions of that?
No, corn, maize doesn't come in until centuries after people are no longer participating in this earthwork construction at Fort Ancient. So corn, beans, and squash is something that really becomes dominant after about 1000 AD. Now, interestingly enough, there are later villages here at Fort Ancient. There are villages down in the valley below Fort Ancient, and there's a village in the South Fort. Now you're thinking, but Bill, you said these people didn't live in villages.
Yeah.
These villages date to about 1,000 years after the earthwork was completed. Those people were growing corn, beans, and squash.
Now, as I understand it, the people who built Fort Ancient are referred to as Hopewell people, but that's not their name.
Correct. We don't know what name they called themselves. And increasingly, we think of Hopewell maybe not even so much as a culture or even as a series of behaviors. Hopewell really represents a religious movement that's happening all throughout Eastern North America during this time. But this religious movement has a fluorescence in Southern Ohio that it doesn't really reach anywhere else.
Now, as part of that movement, would that dictate what kind of mounds were being built?
Yeah, the sites that are being built in Southern Ohio are largely unparalleled in other places. Hilltop enclosures like Fort Ancient, for example, are only built in Southwest Ohio. Other than one kind of unusual site in Tennessee, there are no other hilltop enclosures in the United States. Whereas in other parts of Ohio, around Chillicothe or east of Columbus, they're building big geometric earthworks. And part of the reason for that is there's a big difference in the geology of these areas. It'd be pretty difficult to build one of those geometric earthworks in the spot where Fort Ancient is. And likewise, Fort Ancient wouldn't necessarily fit as easily into some other places.
Now, we often think of as, well, Fort Ancient is where the mound builders lived, but they were really all over the place.
They were. And people are building earthworks and mounds at least as early as 1000 BC or so in Ohio. But after about 500 AD, they're infrequently built. So there's a limited period that people are building mounds, regardless of what their function may be.
Now, it gets a tad confusing because, is it about 1,000 years after Fort Ancient was built, a group of people are called the Fort Ancient people, but they did not build Fort Ancient.
Correct. It's very confusing. We have a long history in archaeology of confusing names. We call it a fort, but it's not a fort.
Yeah.
We call the people Fort Ancient, but they didn't build Fort Ancient. So very early on, archaeologists who were working here at Fort Ancient were seeing these villages, and they had no sense of the depth of time, the relationship in time between these different occupations. And so they thought, oh, well, we think the people who lived in this village are obviously the people that built the earthwork. They didn't recognize this huge gap in time, so they named them the Fort Ancient culture. Now, it's really confusing because I'm the site manager of Fort Ancient, and I'm a specialist in Fort Ancient culture. And if anybody thinks it makes sense, they're not really following me. They're not paying attention.
Yeah.
The Fort Ancient culture are the true corn, bean, and squash farmers. Those people did occasionally build earthworks and mounds, and particularly those are the people that built Serpent Mound.
Okay, now that's about 1,000 years later?
About 1,000 years later.
Okay. Any evidence of a culture before Fort Ancient is built?
People are living in this area, in Warren County and in Ohio, at least as far back as 11,000 years ago, and probably as far back as 15 to 16,000. We know 11,000 because there are numerous sites dated to that time period, well-dated sites. we don't have anything really older than that we can point to and say, that's a very good, well-dated site. But there is one in Pennsylvania called Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, one of the oldest sites in all the Americas. And people there, around 16,000 years ago, have Flint Ridge flint from Ohio that they're using. So we know that people are in Ohio. We don't find places like Meadowcroft Rock Shelter very often.
Now, are we, Fort Ancient, the largest prehistoric community center in North America?
It's the largest hilltop enclosure in North America. Yeah.
Well, Bill, let's go to another part of Fort Ancient where perhaps the mounds are a little bit more obvious.
Yes. Let's take a walk.
Okay. Bill, where are we now in Fort Ancient?
So at this point, we are more in the middle fort. So we have the north, the middle, and the south. So we are about halfway towards the south fort.
Now, some of the mounds behind us are far more easy to understand and to recognize.
Yes, definitely. When you're in the middle fort, that's actually where it's most visible because you can see both sides as you're going down. The site is so big when you're in the north or south fort, you can't always necessarily see the other side from one side.
And Fort Ancient is like a dumbbell or a figure eight or
correct,
or a bow tie, if you will.
Yep, and we're at that narrow spot right now.
Yeah. Now behind me, you pointed out there used to be a water. How'd you phrase it?
There are retention ponds or water features. These are constructed with the earthwork. They're part of the architecture of the site. All around the inside of the walls, there are these pits that are dug. They line them with gravel, and then those hold water, but they're not meant to hold water year round. They fill up in the spring. They are vernal ponds, so temporarily in the spring, there's a whole different ecosystem that emerges during that time. Different animals like salamanders and things that wouldn't be present necessarily the rest of the year. These are also very helpful because that is where we've been able to have someone do a pollen core. So you can see what does the pollen of this area look like over the last 2,000 years and look at it through time.
Now, Fort Ancient is, and most people around the area are waiting anxiously to find out something that might happen in Arabia, is it?
Saudi Arabia.
What is hanging in the near future?
So one of the biggest things that's ever happened at this site. So Fort Ancient and 7 other sites that are all similar time period, same culture, have all been nominated together for World Heritage status. World Heritage is not something Americans are generally very familiar with, but it's a very big deal. So these sites, this is a very long process. We've been working on this for more than 15 years.
Yes.
The last 5 years, really hard. We're at the end of that process. On September 19th or 20th, in Saudi Arabia, UNESCO will have the vote on whether to inscribe these 8 sites as the United States' newest World Heritage Site.
What's UNESCO?
So UNESCO designates World Heritage Sites. The United States only has 24 right now. They can be of cultural or natural heritage, but the general idea is that they have such outstanding universal value that their importance transcends national boundaries. Fort Ancient is one of those such places.
Give me an example of a World Heritage Site the United States has.
The Mammoth Cave is a World Heritage Site. There are 8 Frank Lloyd Wright houses that together comprise one World Heritage Site. The closest one to us is Falling Water. So Ohio has none right now. Mammoth Cave and Falling Water are the closest.
Now, Fort Ancient, you mentioned, is part of like a half a dozen other spots will be one World Heritage Site. What other spots would be included?
Yeah, so it's Fort Ancient. East of Columbus in Newark, Ohio, there are 2 different parts of the Newark earthworks. One is called the Great Circle, the other is called the Octagon. So those are 2, and then the other 5 are sites in the Chillicothe area. Those are operated by the National Park Service, and the main one there is Mound City. The Mound City group is is where their museum is, and that's kind of the center of the 5.
Now, since we have different organizations currently controlling these sites, will that change with World Heritage recognition?
It will not. World Heritage does not mean that the site is being run by someone else or that some new kind of rules apply. It's a recognition that you are already following the best standards of preservation, that you've done everything you can to protect the site long term, that you're interpreting it at the highest level possible. So it's really a reflection of where you have to be to get World Heritage status.
Now, as I understand it, once Fort Ancient gets that World Heritage site, international tourism will jump dramatically in this area.
We think it will. It will probably take time. World Heritage is something that people around the world are much more familiar with, and so people do plan travel. But it will also, more importantly, the real boost in attendance will come from people who already live in this region, who maybe just weren't aware or hadn't decided to visit yet.
Well, Fort Ancient was the state's first state park, as I understand it.
It was, yeah.
Yeah, so it's gone a long way since then.
We've come a long way.
Yeah.
It is no longer a state park. It is now run by the Ohio History Connection. We are Ohio's history partner. We're technically not a state agency, but we are funded by the state of Ohio primarily, among other sources. And we undertake certain activities on behalf of the state.
Okay. Well, Bill, is there anything else we should tell the viewers about Fort Ancient? When's a good time to visit?
The best time to visit will be October 7th and 8th, between 9 and 6 both days. We're going to have a big open house, free admission, and that's where we're going to be celebrating Fort Ancient's inscription on the World Heritage List.
And for those who don't know, where are we located? Where is Fort Ancient?
Fort Ancient is on State Route 350 in Oregonia, Ohio, and very easy to get to from I-71. There are 2 different paths to get here.
Okay. Well, Bill, thank you so very much for showing us around Fort Ancient. This is a fantastic place if you haven't been here before. I'll see you around town, folks.